Good evening. As we continue discussing the Makkos and connecting the 10 Makkos to the 10 Spheros, the second one of the Makkos is Tzvardeya, frogs. And actually, before I go any further, I just wanted to mention to anybody listening that in case you are going to be playing this recording over in the presence of children, our discussion of Tzvardeya, since we'll be talking a little bit about Froggy when a courtin, might not be appropriate for a younger audience. Tzvardeya, the frogs, corresponds to the second one of the 10 Spheros, again, working from the bottom up. And that is the Sphera of Yesod. Yesod, which literally means foundation, but in Kabbalistic terms, Yesod refers to the phallic symbol. How does that connect? The idea of the phallic symbol, the idea of the connection between two people, is in certain ways very similar to one of the outstanding features of frogs, namely that frogs are constantly in a process of communicating. These are both ways of connecting to another person. And actually, we find something very interesting about the tzvardeim, about the frogs, which I think is very important to understand, both about verbal communication as well as the sexual communication as well. And that is that our sages tell us that when Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were ordered to bow down to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar under penalty of being thrown into a furnace, so the Gemara says that they made a kal v'chomer from the tzvardeim, and they said that if the pasuk teaches us that in Egypt, the frogs who don't even have a commandment about sanctifying the name of God, but the frogs willingly put themselves into positions, the pasuk says they jumped into ovens. The frogs made themselves vulnerable. So surely human beings who have a mitzvah of sanctifying the name of God, certainly they had an obligation to put themselves into a situation in which your lives were in danger, in which they were very vulnerable. So I was thinking that perhaps we can understand that that might be a connection between frogs and verbal communication and the yesod, the making of the sexual connection. Because in both of those cases, vulnerability is an extremely important aspect of the success of either one of those connections. If you want to have a real conversation with another person, if you really want to connect to them, if you're not willing to make yourself vulnerable, a true connection will never come about. So that is my suggestion as to the connection between the frogs and the second one of the spheros from the bottom up, the sphera of Yesod. I want to mention that even though when I embarked on this project, I saw a number of works that kind of introduced me to this idea that each one of the Makkos, each one of the plagues, corresponds to one of the spheros. Unfortunately, when I actually started reading what they had to say about each one of the Makkos individually, they were really very short on guidance as to how any of the Makkos connected to any of the spheros. So much of what I'm going to be saying tonight and tomorrow night is sort of like my own ideas that I came up with, definitely based on what I saw elsewhere, but these are primarily my connections. The third one of the Makkos, the third plague, was kenim, lice. And kenim connects to the sphere of Hod. Now, Hod is one of those words that it's a little bit difficult to really know what it means, because there's a number of different possible legitimate interpretations. Hod could be something like splendor or glory, and Hod could also mean acknowledgement. I want to go with the approach over here of acknowledgement. What you have to understand is that when it came to the first two Makkos, the blood and the frogs, so the Khartoumim, the sorcerers of Mitzrayim, successfully duplicated what Moshe and Aaron did, at least on some level. But when it came to the kenim, when it came to the lice, they were unable to duplicate it. So it's clear that these so-called sorcerers in Egypt definitely had quite a bit of skill. You know, in general, within the Sfarim, within the Jewish works, there's a little bit of a debate as to whether or not the quote-unquote magic that was being performed by these sorcerers, was it really magic? Were they somehow tapping into some supernatural power? Or was it, as Arthur C. Clarke put it, that any sufficiently advanced tech simply knew how to do things that other people didn't know how to do, and that's why people bought the story that it's magic? If you want to see a little bit more about that, read Mark Twain's book, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Either way, when it came to the Makkah of Kenim, that was something that the Khartoumim, the black magicians in Egypt, weren't able to do. Whether if it was real magic and their magic just couldn't do that, or if it was some sort of trick or technology that they had which allowed them to reproduce the first two Makkos, when it came to Kenim, they were unable to duplicate what Moshe did. And therefore, they were forced to acknowledge that Etzba Elokim He, that what Moshe Rabbeinu had done was a finger of God. So I want to suggest, therefore, that that's why we could understand that it connects to the sphere of Hod, meaning to acknowledge that what this forced the magicians of Egypt to do was to acknowledge that God was the one who was pulling the strings. Just as an aside, the Chochmas Aaron, he wants to interpret the opposite order of what we're doing. We're basing our understanding on the Zohar, who says the Makkos went through the 10 spheros, starting with the lowest one and working its way up. And the Chochmas Aaron, he wants to understand that it's starting from the top and working its way down. And therefore, there's basically two ways to understand the spheros, and we're not going to get into it now, but the real issue is whether or not Da'as is considered to be one of the spheros. Assuming it is, according to his count, Da'as would be the third one, and therefore Kenim, the lice, corresponds to Da'as. Now, the concept of Da'as is it's a sphera which indicates a blending. Because first you have Chochmah and Bina, which we'll explain later on, and they blend together and create Da'as. That's why also in Chumash it says Vayeda. Okay, when Adam had relations with Chava, Da'as, knowledge, is the word that's used to indicate it, because Das is a synthesis. So when Adam gets together with Chava, that's also synthesizing two things and mixing them together. However, as we touched on a little bit yesterday, on the side of impurity, there is no such thing whatsoever as das, as making a synthesis, because of the side of impurity, each one of the impure spheros stands alone. So he explains that's why, even though the magicians of Egypt were able to copy the first two Makkos, but they completely lacked the ability to do anything corresponding to the third Makkah of Das, again, if you're counting from the top down. Moving on to the fourth Makkah, which is Arov. Arov is generally understood as being a mixture of a multitude of animals. And that corresponds to the sphere of Netzach. And once again, Netzach has multiple ways of understanding it. You could understand it to mean eternity, and you could also understand it to come from a word that means victory. There's a very interesting Rashbam. The Rashbam does not understand the word Arov to mean a mixture of wild animals. Rather, he understands that Arov means wolves, ze'ev, wolves. That's how he understands it to mean. And he explains, why are wolves called Arov? Because of the fact that they generally go out to hunt at night. Aaron, in answer to your question, I am sorry, I don't really have, other than what we explained from the Chochmas Aaron to some extent, any way to connect it directly to lice specifically. But anyway, getting back to Arov. So saying that Arov is wolves, and that corresponds to Netzach, what do wolves have to do with the sphere of Netzach? So if you take a look in the Perek Shira, for those of you who are not familiar with the Perek Shira is a midrashic work, some attribute it to David HaMelech, which goes through all of the different things that are found in nature, whether geographical, plant, animal, and assigns to each one of them a song that particular feature of nature sings to Hashem. And generally, these are, you'll find in Tehillim, words of praise for God. And when it comes to the song of the wolf, it's an extremely bizarre pasuk that the Perek Shira chooses. This is the song of the wolf. Al kol dvar pesha, on any manner of iniquity. Al shor, al chamor, al seh, al salma, whether it's an ox, a donkey, a sheep, or a garment. Al kol aveda, or any lost object. Asher yomar ki hu zeh, and he says, this is it. Ad Elokim yavor dvar shneim, the two parties have to come before God to adjudicate their case. Asher yarshion Elokim, if the court finds him to be guilty, yishalim shnaim lire'eu, he must pay double to his friend. And this pasuk is talking about when you gave somebody something to watch, and now when you came back to reclaim what you asked this person to watch for you, this person claims that it's lost. Whether you asked him to watch your ox, your donkey, your sheep, or some garment, and now he claims that it's lost, and you bring him to court, and it turns out that he lied, he has to pay double. This is just like a very, very strange pasuk for wolves to be singing in praise of God. Interestingly, we find the idea of wolves out there to steal money in a very different source. The Gemara tells us right at the end of Maseches Sukkah that there was a young woman named Miriam Bas Bilga. She was from a family of Kohanim, and during the time of the Hellenists, she went and married a Syrian Greek soldiers. And when the Syrian Greeks captured the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, she walked over to the Beis Hamikdash, to the Mizbeach, to the altar, and she kicked it, and she said, "Lucas, Lucas, wolf, wolf, ad Masaya to mechalem emonen shel Yisrael. Until when are you going to waste the money of the Jewish people?" And I'm not going to get into a discussion now about exactly what she felt that the Mizbeach or the Beis Hamikdash as a whole was doing wrong with the money of the Jewish people. But we see over there also this concept of wolf stealing money. And in general, we know that there is a concept that Klal Yisrael, the Jewish nation, is like one sheep among 70 wolves. And I think that that's really what's going on over here. This pasuk that we bring down about the wolf, about stealing an object that's given to you for safekeeping, the real lesson behind that is that the Jewish nation, as we're sent into exile and sort of like we're given over to the nations of the world to watch us, there seems to be a bit of a historic tendency that they end up taking all of our money and of all of our property away from us. But the reality is that even though it manifests itself as a property taking from us, but as we see from the story that it's there in the Beis Hamikdash as well, there's really a deeper fight that's going on, a fight for the spiritual wealth of the world. And therefore, even though generally speaking, the nations of the world are the 70 wolves surrounding the one sheep, but over here, by the fourth one of the Makkos, the Makkah of Arov, again using the Rashbam's explanation that Arov is wolves, at that point in time, the Netzach, the victory, that the Nitzachon, that was for Klal Yisrael, that was for the Jewish people, our victory over those who would take from us. This was our chance now to take from the Egyptians, to take all the spiritual power that was there in Egypt and to make it for the Jewish people. So in short, we explained that Tzfardea, which also, by the way, Rabbi Nachman famously says is Tzipor Dea, which has that word of das, connection. So that Tzfardea symbolizes communication and connection and the need to be vulnerable for either of those to be successful. Kenim is where the magicians of Egypt acknowledged God. That's Hod. And finally, Arov, which we explained is a wolf. That's the fight between the Jewish nation and the other nations of the world for who is going to have control over the spiritual riches of the world. And in this case, with the Makkah of Arov, the Jewish people were able to overcome their enemies at this point in time. Thank you very much for listening. We'll continue in Mirz Hashem tomorrow evening.